In the 1960s, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a conversation that never stopped. On Lenox and 125th, in record shops and churches, on stoops and corners, and especially in barbershops, people talked about rent and cops, about Malcolm and Martin, about Vietnam and the city that forgot them until Election Day. If you wanted the pulse of Black New York, you didn't need a poll. You needed a chair, a cape, and a half hour under the Clippers' hum. The FBI understood that, and they moved in without moving in. By the middle of the decade, the Bureau had already shifted from hunting communists to tracking what it called Black nationalist hate groups, a label that swept in everything from mainstream civil rights organizers to student groups to the Panthers. The public name was COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. That umbrella covered the dramatic stuff you read about later: infiltrations, disinformation, dirty tricks. But the day-to-day fuel for all that came from something quieter: ordinary people in ordinary places feeding information upstream. In 1967, the FBI formalized a neighborhood surveillance plan with a name that tells you exactly how they thought about the communities they were watching: the Ghetto Informant Program. The mission was broad: observe and report on conditions, attitudes, and rumors in predominantly Black neighborhoods across the country. The method was simple: recruit people who were already fixtures on the block: grocers, candy store owners, taxi drivers, barbers, spots where folks talked freely, where politics mixed with small talk, where the real headlines lived between hairlines. Call it a listening post. No microphones planted under the counter, no dramatic wiretaps, just a person in a place reporting what people said and who said it. The logic was cold and efficient. If the barbershop is where news flows, then the barbershop is where you quietly dip a cup. Harlem became a prime target, not because it was violent, but because it was influential. It was a cultural capital, a political crossroads, a stage for ideas. When national movements flared, their sparks often landed here. If you were the Bureau and you wanted early warning about a march, a boycott, a new leader drawing a crowd, Harlem's everyday spaces were the best radar you could buy for cash in an envelope. Recruitment didn't look the same every time. Sometimes it was a straight pitch: we need your help. Your country needs your eyes. Here's a stipend for your time. Sometimes it felt more like pressure, a reminder about licenses, permits, or a past favor. Other times it leaned on trust and ego. You're respected. You hear things. Keep us posted. However it happened, the result was the same. Conversations that felt private were feeding a file. Nationwide, the Ghetto Informant Program grew fast. At its height, about 7,000 informants were active across U.S. cities. The program didn't publish a neat roster by neighborhood, and it didn't need to. The point wasn't precision, it was presence. A network of ears wide enough that a federal office could read the mood on a block it barely knew. What did those reports contain? The unglamorous details of daily life that tell you where a community might move next. Which meeting was filling up? Which organizer had the room? How people were reacting after a riot or an arrest? It wasn't evidence for court. It was weather, political weather, poured into memos and routed to desks where strategy was written. Harlem had been watched long before the GIP. The Bureau had files on Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. Later, it tailed Malcolm X's public life and kept tabs on organizations splintering and forming after his assassination. That attention broadened from leaders to locations, from headlines to haircuts. A barbershop became a node, a place where the Bureau could track temperature without ever knocking on a leader's door. The thing about the barbershop is that it's a refuge. It's where men and boys talk boldly because that room belongs to them for 30 minutes at a time. It's jokes and debates and advice you won't say at work. It's where you could admit you're tired or furious or hopeful and get a knowing nod in the mirror. Turning that space into a post meant taking something intimate and making it transactional. It meant adding a second audience to a conversation that already felt crowded with history. The GIP didn't last forever. By the early 1970s, some officials questioned whether all that neighborhood chatter added up to useful intelligence. Publicly, the reckoning arrived a little later. In 1975, the Church Committee, a U.S. Senate investigation, pulled back the curtain on domestic spying, revealing how deep and how ordinary the surveillance had become. Files came out, acronyms turned into stories. The government hadn't just watched radicals, it had watched neighborhoods. When the program officially ended in 1973, that didn't mean the listening stopped. It meant the headings changed. Some informants were reclassified under broader domestic security programs, and local and federal agencies kept using community sources in different forms. The paperwork evolved. The instinct did not. What we don't have is a full map of which Harlem barbers fed which reports. That's partly by design. Files were classified. Some were closed, some redacted, some lost to time. What remains is enough to sketch the shape of the thing. The Bureau targeted everyday hubs, barbershops among them, because those rooms carried the neighborhood's voice. And if you wanted to get ahead of a movement, you followed the voice. There's a temptation to make this a spy thriller, a barber in a hidden wire, an agent in a parked Plymouth, a dramatic handoff in a back alley. Most of it wasn't that. It was slower, duller, and more invasive for being so routine. A steady trickle of notes, a conversation logged as sentiment A haircut that ends up as a line item. It's worth pausing on the why. Officially, the Bureau called it prevention. Learn what's brewing and avoid unrest. Unofficially, the target list tells its own story. The same government that couldn't find the funds to fix Harlem's schools found the funds to sit in its barbershops. Surveillance is a choice. It says what a country fears and what it refuses to fix. If you walk into a Harlem barbershop today, you'll still hear the city, politics, Nick's misery, rent, a new artist someone swears is the future. The room still does what it always did. It makes public life feel personal. The difference is that we now know, in black and white, how attractive that felt to people far outside the neighborhood. There's also a modern echo you can't miss. The listening post is less likely to be a person now. It might be a feed, likes, follows, faces scanned on a corner camera, predictive software drawing heat maps from crime stats and 911 calls. The old line between public and private, between a loud opinion and a logged data point, gets thinner every year. The names change, the premise doesn't. Someone is always listening, and the easy places to hear you are the places you feel most at home. This isn't a story about one bad barber or one famous shop. It's about a system that looked at a neighborhood and saw a problem set. It's about how power learns to hear without being seen. And it's about what that does to a community that has to keep talking anyway, because silence was never an option. Harlem didn't stop because someone took notes. The marches went on. The meetings moved. The music kept rewriting the rules. If anything, the existence of programs like the GIP explains why that persistence matters. People kept speaking plainly in rooms that were quietly wired to the outside world, and somehow the truth still made it out the door. So when you sit for a shape-up and the conversation turns from jokes to justice, remember the history under the Clippers' buzz. Once upon a not-so-distant time, that room was treated like a censor, and yet it stayed a sanctuary. That's the paradox of Harlem and places like it. Even when the state leans in to listen, the community keeps its own counsel. The barbershop is still where you go to be known. That's why the FBI planted listening posts in Harlem, because the barbershop held the city's most honest voice.